Greetings, friends, and welcome back. Today, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. This is going to be a more conversational type video. I'm giving these remarks off the cuff, impromptu. I have some idea of the things that I like to touch on, but I really don't have any kind of structure or set discourse for this particular video, so we'll see how it goes. I think I've been reading a little bit too much Montaigne recently, and his essay style, his way of just moving fluidly from one subject to another based on the interconnections of these things appeals to me. So we'll see if it actually makes sense in terms of an approach to videos, or if the result is just going to be a tangled mess. Hoping for the former, but you never know until you try, do you? So let's give it a shot. So I'd like to make this more conversational in nature, even though, let's be perfectly honest, this is not a conversation. I am alone in a room speaking to a camera. Just broke the fourth wall there. I actually find this very disorienting, and this is connected in a strange way, actually, to one of the things that I need to touch on today. As I've noted in a couple of prior videos, I test as INFJ on the Myers-Briggs personality test, and one of the peculiarities of this particular type is that we actually very much respond to the people in front of us in a very immediate emotional way. I'm constantly reading people's emotions when they're surrounding me based on facial cues and expressions and things of that sort. And at the present moment, I have nobody in front of me. I am staring at an iPhone, and it does not have a very expressive face. So as a consequence of this, I have no real read on the reactions of any of you to anything that I'm doing here. So, I don't know, give me some feedback. Tell me something. Speak to me. Is there anybody actually in there? All right, so Myers-Briggs. I'm starting off today talking about the Myers-Briggs test because it led me to a kind of crisis of self-identity, and I thought that it might be fun to share that. So. Share the load, share the load, the load, the load. Brief word about my history with the Myers-Briggs test. For the longest time, I was actually deeply suspicious of the Myers-Briggs personality test, as I am indeed suspicious of any attempt to categorize human beings on the basis of generalized features of psychology. It seems to me that human beings are a very diverse crowd, and that many times these attempts to neatly separate human beings into different groups tend to obfuscate or ignore completely the borderline cases or the subtle differences that might pertain to these different groups. Human beings are unpredictable, and we are rich and very often filled with bizarre inner contradictions that actually add a certain richness and texture to our lives. And so any attempt to categorically or scientifically distinguish between human groups often seems to me to obscure the most important and the most beautiful parts of our humanity. This also led, for instance, to a very long-standing skepticism on my part as regards astrology. A skepticism which I incidentally no longer hold to because I've simply seen too much evidence of the real characterizing power of astrological descriptions of people, including myself. A quick word on that is all of my fellow Christians out there who tend to be very suspicious of astrology for primarily religious reasons. I don't think that there's actually anything incompatible between Christianity and astrology if astrology is understood in a limited sense. I think that the problems that we often see in ancient enunciations of astrology have more to do with the attempts at divinization that were made through astrology, the attempts to prophesy the future or to set limits on the fates and destinies of human beings, trying to decide when such and such a person should die or whether such and such a person should do X or Y or Z because of the favoring of the stars. If you leave aside that kind of future-reading tendency in astrology, then astrology is nothing more than another attempt to understand the way that human beings are structured, the way that we appear in the world and the things that we do. From a strictly Christian point of view, I don't see that there's any real difference between this attempt to understand human beings and their characters as against, say, the scientific attempt, which tries to reduce human behavior to genetics, for instance. These all seem to me like legitimate ways of approaching human behavior. The problem is always reductionism and trying to use these things in inappropriate ways to, again, forecast human behavior or to limit our freedom as human beings. As to those of you who might dispute astrology on scientific grounds, that's a whole different question, and I'm not here to talk about astrology. Would you stop getting me distracted on these completely irrelevant topics? Back to Myers-Briggs. Okay, my history with Myers-Briggs then. From the start, I didn't like it. I was opposed to it. I thought that it was a bunch of nonsense, and I actually went into this test some 20 odd years ago with the intent of showing just how ridiculous it was. So I took the test, and I came back as INFJ. I'm not going to get into the peculiarities of this. The acronym stands for Introverted, Intuitive, Feeling, and Judging, if I'm not mistaken. I'm by no means an expert in this, and actually know very little about it. I've only applied this to my personal case, and this is not going to be a video about the Myers-Briggs test or about INFJs in particular. I'm using this as a case study. So I read a little bit about this type, and it actually made some sense, but I promptly forgot about the whole thing for another 20 years. Lately, I had the opportunity to take one of these tests again, so I thought, well, why not? And I took it. After 20 years, I came back once again as INFJ. This was a startling level of coherency and one that I wasn't expecting. So I immediately began to investigate this a little bit more deeply and to read about INFJs in particular, and found that there was an alarming degree of correspondence between the descriptions that I was finding and my character. So I thought to myself, nah, this can't be right. So I started looking more into it, and I began obsessively watching videos about INFJs and finding that time and time again, they were getting me in a way that I found actually kind of eerie and uncomfortable. And I thought to myself, nah, this can't be right. So I went back to take another of these tests, and I took another of the tests, completely different website, completely different structure, different questions, different everything, and I came back with, you guessed it, INFJ. So I took a third test, went through the whole test, and I don't know what the results are because at the very end of it, of course, they asked for money in order to see the results, and I'm not going to pay those people. Who knows? That might have been the outlier. This mystery will remain forever. Try to sleep tonight. Naturally, not being content with the results of the first two tests or any of the corroborative material that I've been reading, I decided I was going to take a fourth test. This was probably the most interesting of the tests. I'll see if I can't find it and put it down in the description along with the others that I took, just for anyone who's curious out there. Most of these tests tend to be structured very regularly with, say, 4-point multiple choice or something like this. And this one was a bit more varied in the kinds of questions that it asked. And these questions seemed to me to be a little bit better fashioned. They seemed to be a bit subtler. I liked that test. And that test turned back with INFJ. So I can say with some assurance that if there is any validity at all to these tests, and it seems to me that there must be at this point, I am definitely in the INFJ crowd. What does this mean exactly? All right, so for all of you who don't know, INFJ happens to be the rarest of all of the Myers-Briggs personality types. It is particularly rare in males, which puts me into, I think, the smallest percentile of any of the possible permutations of gender and typology in this test. I'm in a vanishingly small part of the population, according to this test, and this corresponds with certain of my personal experiences. See, I've always felt a little bit strange. I always felt a little bit different from other people. I don't say this to vaunt. There are many times in my life when I would have very happily traded places with somebody who felt themselves to be more normal. It's not easy being the odd one out. I want to talk about strangeness, being a strange human being. I suspect that everybody sooner or later feels a little bit odd, right? There are certainly different situations in which we all find ourselves in which we feel a little bit out of place, and there are probably phases in each of our lives when we feel like we're not quite fitting in the way that we'd like to. So I don't pretend that this is an experience unique to me or to any particular Myers-Briggs type, but I do know that there are human beings who feel stranger than others, or more consistently strange than others. They feel like they don't quite fit in. It's a little bit like everybody has conditions for their lives, right? Internal and exterior conditions. Many of these are universal. We all have to eat. We all have to wear clothing. We all have to breathe and move and speak. But some of these conditions are peculiar to each one of us. There are things that each human being has, that each human being needs, that are not necessarily shared by other human beings. To the extent that one has these kinds of rare inner conditions, one becomes a little bit different from the crowd. One stands out, whether one wants to or not. And in many cases, believe me, one doesn't want to. It's not on the basis of any choice that we've made. It's not on the basis of our deciding one day that we want it to be special or different or anything of the kind. We just are this way. And the odd thing about it is that to the extent that we try to fit in, we're actually in some way offending our own authenticity. We're moving against our grain, which means that people like this are destined in a certain way to be outsiders. In certain moments of my life, I would have actually said that they are condemned to be outsiders, but let's stick with a happier language, shall we? In my words today, coming to the point of this very late phase of the video, are precisely to you strange ones, you different ones. You know who you are. You're the ones who find yourself sitting in dinner parties or crowded halls or listening to speeches or public events or watching films with other people, and you are haunted by a sense of solitude. Solitude in the crowd. Solitude amongst other human beings. I'm convinced that this is one of the most isolating emotions there is. You're that kind of person who looks around you while everyone else is giving a standing ovation to some speech that's been made or some piece of music that's been played, and you're wondering why they're so excited about it, because it did nothing for you. You're the kind of person who finds yourself turning on in a conversation at exactly that moment when everybody else is wondering why the conversation took such a strange turn and what can be done to get it back on track. Or maybe you've explained yourself, your emotions, your thoughts to somebody else in 5 different ways, and you still haven't gotten the point across. They still don't understand you. And you're left sitting there wondering, well, what is this all about? Have I just been unclear? You're the kind of person who finds yourself perplexed by the going trends in society, uncertain why so many people could find such things so interesting, so exciting, so new. I know you're out there because, yeah, I'm strange, but I'm not that strange. I mean, there are others like me. There are others who have this experience. So this is a very peculiar thing because I'm not used to talking about any of this. And right now I'm actually making a video that I intend to publish for the public consumption on YouTube, which means that it could be visualized by any number of complete strangers. This is not the sort of thing that I would even talk about with most of my friends. We are living in interesting times, there's no doubt. Somehow the kind of public anonymity of this particular means of communication makes this perhaps even appropriate. There are some people who are different because they seem to lack certain parts of our common humanity. Think, for instance, of the psychopath. This is a person who has absolutely no empathy for his fellow human beings. He lacks something fundamental in his soul. And for that reason, he's different. And I'm not talking about that kind of a person. I'm talking about the kind of person who has everything that everybody else has, but maybe in a different way. Or there's just something about it which sets us off just ever so slightly from the remainder of our fellow human beings. And I think for people like us, there inevitably comes a point where we end up asking ourselves, why are we made this way? Is this just an accident of material and genetics? Is there some reason behind this? There's a great deal of suffering which comes along with this kind of a state of being. It's not an easy way to be in the world. You often find that your goals or your objectives or your desires in life are somewhat different than those of other human beings. And that means that you're not liable to get a lot of support from other people for these things that you want. Many people might not understand where you're going in the world or where you'd like to go. And this requires an enormous degree of autonomy and confidence, which is not easy to garner, particularly since everywhere you look, everybody seems to think that what you're doing is a little bit strange. And I suppose I've sat down to record this video and presumably to publish it is precisely because I'd like to send a word out to people like me. Maybe just to tell you, you're not alone. There are others like you somewhere out there. And what's more than that, we need you. The world at present needs you to keep going where you're going, to be that one who's willing to break new ground and to do something different with your life. There is far too much conventionality today. There is far too much artificiality. Things are becoming ever more closed around us. One of the effects of technology, the things that I absolutely despise about it, is how it standardizes everything. It offers a veneer of customization and personalization, but beneath that, everything becomes just rigorously the same. Think of something as simple as writing. Writing today means writing on a digital screen. You have a choice of any number of different fonts from which anybody can choose, and you can personalize your appearance, the appearance of your writing to that extent. But how much difference is there between even the most specialized of fonts on the one hand and you sitting down and actually writing with your own handwriting on a piece of paper? There is a uniqueness to our human individuation which cannot be replicated by a computer, never can be replicated by a computer, because the computer is based on a certain degree of necessary standardization. It needs to be standardized in order to have that compatibility between different devices and different programs. And that standardization absolutely eliminates the possibility of our human uniqueness being fully presented to the world. Put otherwise, technology is always attempting to approximate our human individuality, but it's never able to do so fully. And as a consequence, some of that individuality is subtly but necessarily lost the moment it is filtered through any kind of digital means. And that stands as well for what I'm doing right here, what you are doing right here. This interaction that we're having, as I pointed out at the beginning, is not a conversation. You are not here in this room with me, and I'm not in that room with you. We are dealing with an approximation of a human relationship. And that can be very valuable and very beautiful, but it is not the same as a real human relationship. Our entire world is being structured in this way. Our entire world is falling ever more deeply into the trap and the temptation of forcing itself into correspondence with this very subtle standardization. We need people who break out of the standardization. We need people who break out of the mold. And I think that this is something that I've had to spend 40 years to come to grips with, and I still am not quite there. 4 decades of my life have passed, and I still find myself, thanks to a test that I take on the internet, which tells personality types, falling into a kind of personal crisis because I don't quite understand my place in the world or who I am. It's an endless process. It's a lifelong process. After all of this time, I'm only now just coming to the awareness that strangeness is a gift. Your solitude, your isolation is a gift. It will make you stronger, and it will make you richer as a human being. And it will give you those preconditions to do something which breaks out of the deadening grip of this technological world into which we are all plummeting so very quickly. And I know better than most people, I think, just how painful it can be and how alienating. I certainly know the feeling of being with other human beings and wishing that I could connect with them in a way that I evidently can't. I can't help but repeating that I'm not stating any of this with pride. This is just my experience of the world. This is just the way that I've lived for these decades of my life. And to deny it would be equivalent to denying the truth of my condition in the world. I'm not saying I'm better than anybody else, quite possibly the contrary. But I am saying that to those of us who have been given this particular situation, we can justify the strangeness of our existence by the fruits that we bear in the world. This is an old story. This is an ancient story. There's something about human beings that demands that we try to understand ourselves continually. One of the very famous inscriptions over the Temple of Delphi was Gnothi Sauton, which means know thyself. And this became a kind of philosophical call to arms. Somehow self-knowledge is implicated deeply in our actual relation to the world. The better that we know ourselves, the more that we're able to understand the world as such. This is an old manner of approaching philosophy. The new manner of approaching philosophy is rather just try and destroy everything and then see what you can rebuild. All right, this is the famous Cartesian method. Just make a clean sweep of things. Just get rid of everything. Deny everything. Doubt everything that you can. And then we're going to figure out if anything actually stands up to that kind of devastating uncertainty. That is a dangerous approach to philosophy, and I don't think that it has led to many good things. The ancients were much more organic and human with their approach. They began from our actual immediate experience of the world, and they tried to understand things based on that experience. Who are you? How do you see the world? What is the world surrounding you? This is the basis of the Socratic method, where all of the discourses and all of the dialogues that he engaged in were based on simple questions about what is X, right? What is justice? What is bravery? What is the good? And all of this thrusts us back on ourselves, our own understanding of things. We're asked to investigate what we believe and to try to understand more thoroughly our actual existence in the world. This is how we come to terms with our lives. This is how we come to terms with what we are. And I think that there's some use to things like Myers-Briggs personality tests or astrology and all of this. I think as long as one doesn't make of these things a kind of idol or take them as a kind of oracle which expresses the final and fundamental truth about who you are, they can be enormously effective and provocative ways of trying to more fully understand ourselves. You sit down with one of these tests and you take it and it gives you the results, and then it gives you a kind of description of the sort of way that your mind is built. And it might be wrong and it might be right. And that is almost beside the point, because it's a spur to you to try to actually get to the bottom of yourself, to move to the little deeper layer, as Captain Ahab might say. That's an undeniably good thing, and I think it's a real value to these tests. Now, again, I'm not here to argue as to whether or not these are real and valid categories that actually inhere in the world. My experience, again, is that they are frighteningly accurate, at least in my case. But I think the more important question is, do they give you a means of better understanding yourself? And I think if you approach them in the right spirit, they inevitably will. Our human condition is so strange. We're thrown into this world and we're expected to just kind of find our way in it. We're given really no guideposts apart from the things that we find along the way. Things like faith or things like religious beliefs or convictions that might call to us and bring us into them. But even there, particularly nowadays, we're simply set adrift. It's like, here you go, here's a boat. Get in your boat, row, see where it takes you. And you're just sort of floating along, and there might be waves and there might be sharks, and you've got to kind of find your way as you go. Now, the great thing about human beings is that we are such exquisitely social animals. We exist in and for one another. Aristotle once wrote that the only human being who can exist outside of society must be either a beast or a god. Supposing that the latter is not really a possibility for human beings, I think that doesn't leave us many options. We orient ourselves in the world based on the human groups to which we pertain, the people with whom we grow, our parents, our friends, our brothers and sisters. Our society is so inbuilt in us that it becomes our lens for actually viewing the world, for making determinations about what's right and what's wrong, and for deciding where we will go. But that's not the limit of the human being. We are not reduced to that and that alone. And the proof of this is in the fact that there are many human beings who refuse to accept the standards of their day, who say no to the things that they've been taught, the things that they've been given, for better and for worse. So the question is, what happens if you find yourself to be one of those human beings who can't live without society, but at the same time don't quite fit into it? How do you orient yourself in the world? How do you find your way? To some extent, of course, we can and must take the prescriptions that are given to us by society and those people we love. But there's also part of us that doesn't quite accord with that. It might want something more or something less than what society offers us or tells us that we should be desiring. And I think that it's imperative that we begin to actually listen to ourselves, to really understand our inner voice and what actually belongs to our inner selves and what doesn't. That is a hard work. It is the work of a lifetime, I do believe. And I think that I can confirm that after 40 years of existence and finding myself lately being completely overhauled by, again, a simple personality test on the internet. The point is that if we know what we are, what we really are, not what we want to be, not what anybody else would make us, but what we are, then we can begin to use that as the compass rose for our existence. We can take our bearings by this thing that we are. I suspect that there's a correspondence between people who generally find themselves to be at odds with their time or with their societies on the one hand, and people who feel that they have a vocation on the other. This sense of being called to do something is very, very strong in some people and not strong in others. It's a curiosity of our human existence. It's not to say that one group is better than the other. There's just this basic difference that has to be acknowledged by anyone who's actually paying attention to the way that human beings are built or the things that motivate them. There are people in this world who are willing to sacrifice a great deal to obtain things that they believe they have been called to obtain. And sometimes they're wrong about that. There can be false vocations. There can be people who desire things that they should not desire, and who are willing to sacrifice things that they should love in order to get them. There are all manner of complexities here that need to be addressed and moved through on an individualized basis. But I think that all of us would agree that there's something to be said for genuineness in human life and authenticity and trying to live to your true purpose, your true being. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. How do you get to that? How do you actually begin to perceive that? It's not easy. It's not easy for any one of us. Now, the kinds of human being to whom I'm speaking here have certain advantages and certain disadvantages in this. On the one hand, it's easier for them to perceive the things that they actually innately desire, because these things tend to stand at odds with the rest of society. So why in the world would they be pursuing them if they didn't actually want to? There's a kind of clarity that comes from that discrepancy between you and the rest of the world. You can't help but acknowledge that there is truly something individual and unique in you if everybody else seems to find that thing odd or strange. On the other hand, if you really do find yourself possessed of this kind of eccentricity or this kind of strangeness, it can be very hard to hold to that, to give it due respect, to cultivate it. And for the same reason, because you look around you and you find that nobody really understands this thing. Nobody else is pursuing this thing. You're lucky if you can find one or two other individuals who really get you in this way. And if you do, incidentally, hold to those people with all of your power, because they are few and far between. So we have this strange dynamic going on where we might be able to see a little bit more clearly what it is we're supposed to be doing in the world, but it's also more difficult for us to do it because we don't have that same kind of a support structure and that same kind of an innate common understanding which gives us the propulsion necessary to move toward these goals. And here I think comes in one of the great beauties of our technology. It gives us truly the ability to connect with people at a scale unheard of in the entirety of human existence. We can reach across distances unimaginable to find other people who understand what we're trying to accomplish and who have some innate sympathy for the way that we approach the world. It's possible for us to break through our isolation in a way that I think in the past it was very difficult to do. There were other compensating features of the past. There was an education system and a society which tended to perhaps even prize certain kinds of uniqueness, which I think that in our day are strangely lacking. And I say that it's strange because we're living in a democracy in which, diversity is this great prized thing. And yet there's a certain homogeneity underlying this, which is actually very off-putting. I really do think that if you go deep enough, there was actually more diversity of human thought in past times than there is today. Or maybe I should say that that diversity was more prized than it is today. That seems a paradox. That's a long conversation, probably for another time. But anytime you're willing to have it, well, I'm game. My point is simply that those of us who don't quite feel ourselves at home in our time or in our surroundings can, for better and for worse, find community, solidarity with other human beings using the internet as a means to actually reach those people. And there are dangers here as well. People can get lost in online communities. The notion of an echo chamber is a real and dangerous thing. Real human communities are built of many different human beings who don't get along with one another. Your real neighbors might be people that you really detest. Online, if there's somebody you don't like, you can just block them. Just ignore their existence. Pretend like you never had anything to do with them. Put up a barrier, and you never have to look at that human being again in all the days of your life. And so there's something artificial and constructed about these so-called online communities. They don't allow for the diversity and the necessary conflicts of human existence in a way that a real human community cannot escape from. These are things that we have to look at carefully. Any use of our technology, we have to be looking at very carefully. We have to remember that these devices that we hold in our hands, or the applications that we use on them day by day, are built with very clear and explicit purposes. They are not just neutral tools that can be used for good or for evil. They are things with inherent tendencies. They are built to create addictions in us. Many of them are built to incite the worst of our human emotions, things like greed and envy and rage. This is how they gain buyers. This is how they sell. This is how they make their money. So we cannot and must not be naive or ingenuous about the use that's made of these things or the ways in which they might be changing or harming us. Having said all of that, they open up possibilities to us that I think it would be remiss of us not to make full use of. Evidently, I believe such a thing. All right, I'm sitting here in front of this camera, and as I pointed out in my very first video, my very first line on this channel, I was actually just a hair's breadth away from throwing all of this out the window in the not so distant past. I very well and very easily could have gone the route of a Luddite. And this very day, rather than you hearing my words, you would not know of my existence, because I would be living who knows how contentedly with my little farm, my cow, my donkey, my chickens, my ducks. I don't know if you can hear my ducks out there. They've been chattering this entire time. They are a talkative bunch. Hopefully it's not been too distracting. But for a number of reasons that I'll probably discuss in another video, I eventually made the decision that to cut yourself off from the world is a hypocritical and self-contradictory act. To be clear, I have enormous respect and admiration for people who go that route. But I think that there's something that they're not understanding about their condition in the world. And I think this choice that confronted me confronts all of us if we're built in the way that I've been discussing over the course of this video. There really is this point at which you have to decide how you're going to approach your life. And there are only so many possibilities available to us. We can deny who we are and attempt to fit in with other human beings, suppressing or attempting to kill parts of ourselves. Not a route that I'd recommend, and I don't think one that's destined to end in a lot of contentment or happiness. We can separate ourselves from human beings, try to break off of society altogether, live in our own way according to our own lights, and just be hermits, essentially, in the world. And perhaps some of us are called to that. There have been saints who have been called to that. But I think if that is not a very clear vocation in your life, it is only a way of ignoring your fundamental situation, attempting to bury the difficulties that you have, and turning away from your true calling in this world. Or we can attempt to find a way of living in the world with all of our peculiarities, all of our strangeness. And this is the path, I suppose, that I'm attempting to goad you all down. The first path is inevitably self-destructive, and the second path is inevitably self-denying. Only the third path leads to fulfillment. Is it an easy path? No, no, no. It's not an easy path. It will demand of you everything that you've got. I like to think of this a little bit in the light of those old legends of the knight who goes out on a solitary quest. He wanders the countryside, and he's faced with all manner of temptations, and he's faced with all manner of dangers. He's surrounded by the illusions of warlocks and constantly called to abandon his path. But if and only if he persists, he gains the one thing that he could not gain in any other way: his honor and his dignity. And along this path, almost incidentally, he helps any number of individuals in distress. That's part of his cause, part of his calling. So I would wish upon you all the valor of those knights of old as you go about your way in this world, often a wayward and errant way. If you're anything like I am, you will feel yourself sorely inadequate to this task. But if there is a calling, then there is a caller, and there has to be some sense behind this thing to which we've been summoned. Then let it be valor and faith that lead us on. Alright, so that's the end of this rather uncharacteristic video. Uncharacteristic, I've got such an enormous precedent behind me, a whole 6 or 7 videos underneath me at this point, so obviously this is a terrible break from tradition. I do hope that you've gotten something from this. Obviously this was aimed at a rather select crowd, I guess, but maybe more people than I expect will actually find this useful. Please, prove to me that you are a human being and that there are people at the other side of this camera, and leave me some comments down below to tell me what you thought of this and what your own experience of the world is, and whether any of this resonated with you, and how. And that way I can be satisfied that I am not just speaking to myself in this room, and that there actually are other human beings out there with whom I am conversing in a kind of super temporal way, exceeding the limits of space and time, breaking into novel dimensions, and bringing out fundamentally new kinds of human experience and connection. Alright, so with that, farewell to you all, and thanks for watching.